In this video, we'll be taking a look at Shanghai GP3 100 film. This is the first film that I've ever seen that has a blue base like this. Shanghai GP3 is a panchromatic black and white negative film with an ISO of 100, a controlled grain structure, and traditional silver-rich emulsion. For this test, I shot the film at ISO 100, I developed the film in Xtol at 1:1, and for this shot I exposed the shadow on the bicep for a zone 4. When looking at these examples, a couple things stand out to me right away. For one, for a 100 speed film, this film is pretty grainy, so the grain is very apparent. And secondly, the film is pretty contrasty. So you can see that with the shadows at a zone 4, the highlights are pretty bright. Going one stop darker and placing that shadow on the bicep at a zone 3, I think the tones come together a little bit better here. With the film being as contrasty as it is, you have to expose a little bit lower to get those highlights down and those midtones because they're so dense that they kind of glow. And so with the shadow detail on the bicep, I think it holds up. You get a lot more separation in the tones and I think it looks a lot better here. Going one stop darker and placing that same shadow at a zone 2, you can still see quite a bit of density in the highlight areas, and that just goes to show how strong that contrast is. Even with the shadows this far down, you still get quite a bit of density in those highlight areas. I think the separation in the tones looks really good here, and this is probably as far down as you'd want to take the exposure because anything beyond this and you'd start to lose detail, but this goes to show that you can still get a decent image and contrast with this dark of an exposure. If we start to head in the other direction and then place the shadow at a zone 5, you can see how much brighter everything else gets in relation to that shadow. Being that the film is very contrasty, those other bright areas just go way too bright. This is not really usable in my opinion, so you do want to expose your shadows a little bit deeper with this film. And I don't know if this is related to the silver rich portion of the film. If anybody knows, comment below, but I noticed this film has a really dense glowy look, and I'm wondering if that's because of the silver rich emulsion. Moving on to a color chart, one thing that I noticed with this film is that there's variation in the shadows. You get a gradation in the shadows from dark to lighter, but in the highlight areas, everything kind of looks like the same tone. There's not very much separation in the highlights. And then if you look at the actual color cells on the chart, they almost all look like the same tone. There's very little variation amongst the cells on the color chart. If we go one stop darker, you can start to see better separation in those colors on the color chart. So with this film, in order to get good tonality and separation, you do have to expose the shadows pretty dark. If we take a close-up look at the film, in my opinion, it doesn't appear particularly sharp, and it's also quite grainy. So when it comes to 100 speed films, you think of something like an FP4. This doesn't quite look on the same par as films like that. It's a little bit more of a lo-fi look. In conclusion, I think this film definitely has the contrast of a slower film, but it doesn't really have the sharpness and detail of a slower film. So most of the time when you're going to grab a 100 speed, it's because of that. You want that sharpness and detail, and this film doesn't really have that. So I don't think it really fits well as a 100 speed. And being that the shadows can go really deep and still hold detail, and you kind of have to expose deep to get that contrast down, I think you can probably get away with exposing this film at like 200 and using it more as just like a normal point and shoot film rather than a more pictorial, high definition or high detail film. You could probably even get away with exposing this at 400 and just using it as like a cheaper film that you don't really care about the details as much, like more of a point and shoot film. I think it's probably worth giving it a try at 400. I'm thinking now that I might make a video exposing it at 400 and seeing how that goes. What do you guys think of Shanghai GP3? Have you tried it before? Or if not, would you be willing to give it a try? Let me know in the comments, and we'll see you guys next time on The Negative.